Sometimes a video idea comes without much in the way of reason. Like, why do Ghouls and Ghosts, or Ghosts and Goblins or whatever? We're already a couple of weeks removed from Halloween, so I can't even use that as a good excuse. I just, I felt like it. This channel's often all about following my whims more than anything else, and sometimes you should have a whim to just have a look at a classic game, if for no other reason other than to examine why people really get a kick out of it. So, let's do that. Perhaps we can also learn a bit about how, back in the day, an arcade game like Ghouls and Ghosts would be built, punched, kicked, and eventually dragged into being. Of course, however, all of this doesn't start with Ghouls and Ghosts. That is a sequel, after all. In my book, one of the best sequels in the history of the arcade. It starts, however, with Ghosts and Goblins. And more specifically than that, it starts as the brainchild of a man who, when he first got hired by a video game company, had so little knowledge about games that he didn't even know that that was what his new employers specialised in. That man's name was Takuro Fujiwara, and he would evolve from a man who knew nothing about games into a Hall of Fame calibre video game designer. The list of titles that the man often known as Professor F had a hand in as producer or director is quite outrageous. Commando, Bionic Commando, a ton of Mega Man games including basically all of the classic ones, DuckTales, Sweet Home, Chip 'n Dale, Gargoyle's Quest, Little Nemo, Resident Evil, Breath of Fire, Tomba. There's a lot of hits. And of course, the games that we're covering today. Fujiwara came to Capcom, at that point a still young company named Capsule Computers, in 1983, having spent a year with Konami, during which time he scored with Puyan, his very first game. He'd hit the ground running at Capcom with his first game there, Vulgus, a pretty neat little space shooter. For someone who didn't even really have an interest in video games before joining Konami, Fujiwara was learning pretty sharpish. After Vulgus, he found himself taking on two projects at basically the same time, and both of them would end up being highly influential arcade classics that would help establish Capcom as a pretty good studio. The first? Commando, a game that, alongside SNK's Ikari Warriors, were crucial when it came to popularising the top-down run-and-gun genre. The second was Ghosts and Goblins, and Fujiwara was on record as saying that of the two titles, he far preferred working on the latter. In creating Ghosts and Goblins, or Makaimura Demon World Village, as it's known in Japan, Fujiwara was inspired in his words by the cartoons of his youth. We're not exactly sure what cartoons caught his fancy, although the general art of Ghosts and Goblins seems to take a lot more from spooky western images as opposed to, say, Japanese yokai. So hey, perhaps the game was inspired by episodes of Scooby-Doo. It managed to become a part of a wave of games that truly established the greatness of the silky smooth side-scrolling platformer. Namco made the first important step with the release of Pac-Land the previous year, and from there most people would naturally go straight to Super Mario Bros. Because, well, that's just obvious. However classic Mario may be, however, it wasn't in a vacuum. In fact, Super Mario Bros. On the NES and the original arcade Makaimura came out within a mere 6 days of each other, in September of 1985. Both are very different games indeed, showing not only the brilliance of the genre, but the variety of it too. Ghosts and Goblins, of course, puts you in the shoes of Sir Arthur, beard and all, and tasks you with defeating the occupants of Satan's demon world that have taken over the land in order to rescue Princess Prin-Prin. Many of the enemies that Arthur faces along the way have become famous in their own right, creations such as Astaroth or Lucifer, the final bosses in Ghosts and Goblins and Ghouls and Ghosts respectively, along with one of the most fiendish enemies in video game history, the dreaded Red Arima, who flies in unpredictable patterns, spoiling your day and usually turning you into a pile of bones. The Arima has an amusing origin. He is not only named after, but actually bears a resemblance to one of Capcom's lead programmers, Toshio Arima. By the time Fujiwara realised the somewhat cruel joke, the monster was already set in stone and there wasn't any going back. Eventually, however, the design of the monster proved so strong that the Red Arima would be renamed Firebrand and star in a spin-off series all of his own, Gargoyle's Quest. Ghosts and Goblins, as an arcade game, puts you through 6 levels, at least that's what you think, of savage platforming. The game's difficulty level is the stuff of legend. Enemies come at you from all angles, many times in ways that can be difficult for Arthur to deal with, seeing as he can only shoot in front and he can't change the direction of his jump. This fixed jump in particular makes any leap potentially lethal. He can at least survive one hit. The first removes his suit of armour and leaves him in his tighty whities, and the second kills him and turns him into a skeleton. The only other helping hand is that levels do at least have a checkpoint halfway through, making it somewhat satisfying just to push through to the halfway point of a stage, let alone beat it. Other than that, well, it's brutality all the way. Even some of the weapons aren't exactly fit for purpose a lot of the time. I'm sure we all utterly hate the torch, don't we? James Wolfe wasn't joking when he said that you want to get the knife as soon as possible and then guard it jealously. So why is Ghosts and Goblins so hard? Arcade games are usually hard, of course. They kind of have to be in order to generate a quick turnover of customers and thus actually make the arcade any money. But even with that in mind, this is one of the toughest arcades out there. Fujiwara has protested this, saying that making money was not the primary objective of the game, even when you put all of its cruel tricks and twists to him, including the most infamous one that requires you to defeat the game twice before actually reaching the final boss and getting an ending. The need for arcades to make money was definitely in Fujiwara's mind without making the game impossible, and thus not one that people were going to even bother with. But he definitely wanted to make a game that was going to be tough to master, one for skilled players. There's no doubt that he certainly achieved that. Is that genuine? Well, most likely. Another little clue as to how the game got so hard comes from an interview Fujiwara gave to Famitsu. He explains that he did a lot of location testing on the game. He would go to arcades and watch people play, and if he felt that players were getting through a section too easily, well, he'd rush back and make changes. He'd make note of any little cheap trick that players were using and then try to stop them. You can see this for yourself if you look at the game's beta version on MAME and compare it with what was released. There are much less enemies in the prototype of the game, and it's a lot easier to go through stages. You just don't get stopped as much. Fujiwara feels that in the end the difficulty of Ghosts and Goblins is indicative of the time it was released in, and he's perhaps not too far wrong even if the game is harder than most. In many ways it's an example of what had to be done back in those days. In this time, arcade games were usually developed from start to finish in about 3 months. It was a huge struggle not only to get noticed, but to try and have something that stood out and that other companies didn't have. That was what Fujiwara wanted. The 2 games he worked on at the exact same time were a perfect example. With Ghosts and Goblins he got something that stood out. Commando's time was a bit more short-lived, as SNK's Ikari Warriors would come out not too long afterwards and steal some of Commando's shine. There are also of course the many home ports of this game to consider as well. Indeed, Ghosts and Goblins is often thought of as a home game as opposed to an arcade one. It just seems to belong there. And while I could go on a bit about the various microcomputer ports of this game, all done by Elite and of varying quality, the most famous of these ports by a long distance is on the NES. This is where Ghosts and Goblins really made its name. The arcade cab was never that big of a hit, especially not in its home country of Japan. NES Ghosts and Goblins is, on the other hand, a quintessential platformer of the era, even if the actual quality of the port is a bit lacking. The gameplay itself is largely intact, but the technical quality is a bit ropey, with some very rough scrolling and an infamously horrific translation. A lot of this is down to Capcom contracting the port out to a rather anonymous developer called Micronics, who acted as guns for hire for a fair few studios back in the day. Micronics also worked on ports for Capcom's 1942 and Sun, and both of those are also, well, not the best games technically. The NES clearly could have done a much better job. And yet, it is still a playable game, if also a very savage one indeed. And of course it wouldn't be fair to just not really mention those microcomputer ports. As I said, they are a mixed bag. The C64 version does have some very good music, but the quality of the gameplay is lacking. The gameplay is a lot better on the Spectrum version, but the presentation just isn't that good. And the Amstrad version is kind of a rebel. A good mix of graphics and gameplay, but it also screws around a lot with the layout of the game and even has a totally different and actually quite awesome remix of the original's music. But there was never really a perfect, classically brilliant port of this game, at least not until the PlayStation generation. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why, comparatively, the game's sequel tends to get a lot more shine today than the original that it spawned from. Information on the development of Ghouls and Ghosts, coming 3 years after the release of the original game, is a bit more thin. Perhaps that's to be expected. This isn't a wildly different sequel. The formula was already there, and it was just a case of putting in more of the same. Takuro Fujiwara has said simply that he was very happy with the game. The key part of the process perhaps wasn't the making of the game itself, but rather making it for the system it was going to be on. The game is important from a development perspective because it was one of the first games to be made for Capcom's new arcade board, the CP system, better known as the CPS-1. Indeed, it was the second CPS-1 game, coming a few months after Forgotten Worlds. The CPS-1, more than most of their games even, is one of Capcom's most important creations. Why was the CPS-1 so key to Capcom's success? It was a step forward from the traditional one-game-only arcade boards that they had been creating. With the CPS-1, games would instead be stored on a regular old cartridge. By this point, arcade owners were used to rewiring and switching up the ROMs on boards in order to convert one game to another and retain the cabinet, but the CPS-1 provided a much faster and more elegant plug-and-play solution. And it worked. The CPS-1, along with the games that came out for it, were key to making Capcom one of, if not the very top arcade game company out there in the late 80s, all the way through to the early to mid 90s when they introduced its successor, the CPS-2. Capcom even released a Japan-only, and very rare these days home console in the 90s that was compatible with CPS-1 boards, the Cps Changer. This was kind of like an official Super Gun that used Super Famicom controllers as standard, and could even be used, albeit not always perfectly, with other Jammer standard arcade boards. You weren't supposed to do that, and Capcom tried to use the design of the system as a way to prevent that, but people easily found workarounds. As for Ghouls and Ghosts itself, well, as I said, it's more of the same. 3 years have passed since the events of the first game, and now the hordes of Satan are back again, possessing the natives of the land and, yes, once again capturing Sir Arthur's beloved Prin Prin. And so he must don the suit of armour again and lay these busters down. There's a lot about Ghouls and Ghosts that makes it feel more like a re-envisioning of the original than a flat-out sequel. A lot of the old enemies make their return, including the dreaded Arima, and the stages themselves are pretty similar to the first game, taking the journey from villages to towns to depths and eventually to the castle itself. But there are a whole bunch of additions to the game that make it not just more than a simple souped-up graphics remake of the original, but end up making it a significantly better game. First off, there's the quality of life additions. Arthur can now shoot straight up instead of merely forwards, which seriously helps a massive amount when it comes to dealing with enemies. There's also the magic armour, which can be found in the newly added treasure chests. This golden suit allows Arthur to charge up a magic attack depending on his current weapon. It also, if used right, can provide a few precious frames of invincibility. And yes, there's the treasure chests. You want to scour them for the golden armour, of course, but a lot of them contain wizards which will, if not immediately dealt with, temporarily turn Arthur into an old man or a duck. Because of course Ghouls and Ghosts still very much remains a bastard. Even if Arthur has a couple more tools at his disposal, this is still a beast of a game indeed. And yes, you have to go through it all twice if you want to face off against Loki and finish the game properly. But on the whole, when I think of this series, Ghouls and Ghosts is absolutely the first game that springs to mind. Although much like the original, I don't really think of it as an arcade game. Hell, I'm not sure if I recall ever actually seeing a Ghouls and Ghosts cabinet. Like the original, this always has felt more like a game for the home, and one particular port of the game stands out over all the others. Ghouls and Ghosts on the Sega Mega Drive. A very special port of the game indeed, one of the earliest arcade ports on the system, and one of the best. Even if it's not the most successful of arcade games, Sega could point to this and say that with Ghouls and Ghosts, they truly were bringing the arcade experience home. Sega themselves handled the port of the game. Indeed, it would largely be done by the legendary Yuji Naka, who would soon go on from works like this port to creating the almighty Sonic the Hedgehog. Takuro Fujiwara is full of praise for this port, while also slyly reckoning that Sega perhaps took some of the code from the original arcade wholesale in order to help the port along. Not that this would be surprising, seeing as the Mega Drive and the CPS-1 are both based on the Motorola 68000 CPU. Anywho, while Ghouls and Ghosts isn't absolutely arcade perfect, with the graphics and the sound taking a slight downgrade, it's not exactly far off. It certainly looks and plays the part. The average player wouldn't really be able to notice much of a difference. Which means that it's easier here to concentrate on the sheer fun of just playing the game. For all the frustration it brings, the game is a blast. It helps at least that there's infinite continues and you always start from your last checkpoint. And that's kind of important because, well, you're going to be dying a lot. Death comes at you fast in this world. It never quite seems to send the same patterns at you, always making the enemy slightly random in a way that prevents you from fully learning how to get through a stage by rote. It may well have you tearing your hair out at points, particularly in the later stages. You may well scream and shout and say that the day Takuro Fujiwara was born was one absolute fucker of a day indeed. But that's almost expected, I feel. In its presentation, Ghouls and Ghosts is almost like a dark comedy, a game with a sick sense of humour. It strips you down to your pants and then kills you in various amusing ways, whether it's through turning you into an old fogey, or just sticking the odd spike up your arse where you didn't expect it. The pressure of increasingly more intricate action sequences, of which this game is filled with memorable ones, leading to inevitable mistakes and stupid deaths. In order to master this game, you have to laugh back at it and not let the endless failure get to you. Why, some would say that it's like the late 80s answer to Dark... Actually, good lord, let's not go there. We're not theorists after all. Ghouls and Ghosts, at the time of its release, was not necessarily the high watermark in terms of arcade pizzazz, but it was a damn fine game, and the Mega Drive version was a true great, an important title in the early years of the machine. That's an important thing to recognise about this series. Even if these games were never the main event, never front and centre, they played a very important supporting role in the history of Capcom and of video games. A lot of great names have some contribution to the story of Ghosts and Goblins, big or small, in their portfolio. Even the microcomputer conversions of Ghouls and Ghosts, largely handled by US Gold, but actually pretty good considering the systems they're on, allowed the likes of Tim Follin to work their magic over the game's soundtrack and produce some pretty memorable tunage. Still, for all the plaudits, there were only 3 games in the series back then. Sir Arthur would make his return in the SNES-only Super Ghouls and Ghosts, another absolute brute of a game with all the additions that improved Ghouls and Ghosts, as well as a few more like different suits of armour and the rather fun double jump. This is pretty good. Indeed, it's most people's favourite game in the series, although I would have to pick the original Ghouls and Ghosts over it, mainly because I really do struggle to deal with the slowdown in this game, an unfortunate outcome of the SNES, well, just lacking that all-important blast processing, obviously. Although in all seriousness, the slowdown is a bit of an annoyance, and something that marred not just this but other Capcom games released earlier in the system's life, such as UN Squadron and Final Fight. They seemed to figure it out later on. Perhaps if this was released a couple of years later, and without the slowdown, it would be, basically, free of any problems. It is a bloody good game after all. Alas, this game, which never saw the inside of an arcade, was the last of Sir Arthur's adventures for many years. The Ghosts and Goblins series wasn't ever that big in the arcade, nor was it that big in Japan. It was always a series of games that very much appealed more to Western audiences, and ultimately it fell by the wayside. A bit of a shame considering how important a series it actually is. Although it wouldn't totally end. The Firebrand spin-off Gargoyle's Quest would continue onto the SNES, and the absolutely fantastic Demon's Crest. A series of 3D platformers called Maximo would garner plenty of attention in the 2000s, and there was ultimately a nostalgia-filled final sequel, Ultimate Ghouls and Ghosts, for the PSP. Not to mention tons upon tons of indie games, the likes of Maldita Castilia and Volgar the Viking, that wouldn't exist without having these games as a major influence. In the end, there's a lot of good that came from Ghosts and Goblins. Its numbers might not have been as much as you would expect them to be considering its status, which is why the series ended up being cut short, but its influence is undeniable. In the end, the world of video games would, I think, be significantly different if Ghosts and Goblins never existed. And that perhaps is the best and maybe the most profound thing I can think of to say about Sir Arthur and his challenging and, yes, often embarrassing adventures. Bye for now. Thanks for watching this video about the history of Ghosts and Goblins. If you like this video then hey, please do like it, have a look at my social media, and perhaps also have a look at my Patreon. Perhaps you could join this lovely list of people right here. Alexa Jones Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Andy Cat, Asobi Kwan DX, Brian Henniger, Chris, Cody Spooner, Conrad Pritchard, D. Xalior Rimwan Sutter, Dave Cork, David Rose, Dinty76538, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Geordie Alex, Glunthef, Ian Roberts, James Brown, Jason Stevens, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Lucas Kaligoski, Mateus Granzov, Martin Pataki, Potter Margel, Ren Bimon, Rusty Kelly, Samir Alamar, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Tariq Amir, The Geeky Dad, Tim Wald, Yerka Operator, and all the rest of the community. Thank you so much, and goodbye.